Hi, if you're here, you're probably thinking about making rings out of silver clay, and you've also possibly heard contradictory information about the best way to do that. As with most things, there is a best right way to do it, and then there are other ways to do it. In this case, that best right way is to use sterling silver clay, which makes for a stronger fired result than fine silver clay. However, sterling silver clay must be fired in a kiln because it cannot be fired with a torch. And so this video is really for the people who don't have access to a kiln and still want to make fine silver rings. So while I will always recommend using sterling clay for rings because that does make for the strongest results, let's talk about some methods for making strong, torch-fired, fine silver clay rings. I will be using art clay silver to make 2 rings. This is what else you will need. A ring mandrel for sizing. This is a metal stepped mandrel. Parchment paper and tape for making sleeves, some shaping tools, a work surface, rolling slats or playing cards, and I use a clay dryer, which we'll look at in a bit. So let's make a sleeve. We need to cut this to fit within the step and make it not overlap more than just enough to fully close the loop. I'm going to aim for a ring that will fit a size 6, so I'm going to go 2 sizes up, and we will talk through the nuances of sizing. One design choice that we're going to make specifically due to using the fine silver clay is we want the fired ring band to be 1.4 millimeters thick or thicker. I will start by rolling my clay out at about 7 cards thick. We can use stacked rolling slats that add up to 7 cards thick or 7 actual playing cards. Either option stacks up to about 1.8 millimeters thick, and that accommodates the shrinkage that will come both as it dries and as it fires. After I place down a matching set of cards, I'm going to use my fresh clay to roll a thick snake. Now, the easiest way to blend ring ends into each other is to use no texture so that you can blend and then repair and smooth it out. I'm going to complicate this by using a texture so that we can talk about how to deal with that. The texture tile here has been treated with a release agent. I use Cool Slip. And then I press it down as firmly as I can into the clay. I place my slab on my prepared sleeve and then tack it down on one end with a little bit of paste. Then press or roll a little slope into the end of the clay. I bring the other end down to overlap, and then cut the end on an angle. Note the angle of the knife here. If while doing this you nick the clay below, you'll have to make a judgment call on whether you still have a solid layer, solid enough to attach everything, or if you need to start over. Basically, if you sever the part below, you need to start over. I'm going to go back with the knife and make this angle even steeper to match with the slope below, so that when they close, they make complementary angles, more or less, and I don't have a big bump where they go together. So you don't do this yet, but I'm going to push this down to show you how with the 2 slopes stacked, the overlap of the bands isn't really any thicker than the rest of the band. And now I'm going to open this back up so it looks like yours, which is still open, and we'll close them properly, which means putting in enough paste to fill the gap and then some. To close it, I'm going to push the top down while also pulling the ends very gently towards each other. Then I can really press this down. As needed, I remove any extra paste and trim the edges to match. And now the priority is to make sure that these ends are well joined into each other. Some people just add paste. I am going to add a touch of water and use the needle tool to really blend the clay into itself. You can see how if there was no pattern, this would be much less of an issue because then you could let this dry, add some clay, and smooth and fully hide the seam. But I do have a pattern, and now I have a gap in the pattern, and so I'm going to show you an alternative way to hide this. First, the ring needs to be dried on the mandrel, and here's a little secret. If you're using heat like I am here with my clay dryer, put the seam side down first so that dries and doesn't pull apart while the other side dries. Once it's about 80% dry, it needs to come off the mandrel so its shrinkage isn't restricted by the mandrel. And if you do use a heat source, rotate the ring every couple minutes. While that dries, we're going to make a second ring. The starting steps are the same. I'm going to start with fresh clay and I'm going to make a thick snake. One difference here is that I've put down a protective layer over my work surface because in a minute I'm going to cut the clay. Again, pressing in my pre-treated texture tile. And now I'm going to use a tissue blade or another straight blade to trim the edges of my clay parallel. Now here's another hot tip. Once your sleeves have been used, they're likely wrinkled, and while I love the idea of reuse, these wrinkles would transfer to the next ring, which would give you just a little more work to do to smooth it out, so I advise starting over with a fresh sleeve. On goes the clay. I make sure it's straight. Tack it down, give it a little slope. Wrap it around onto itself. I'll put paste on first this time, which is maybe a slightly more advanced technique, because now I have to work around the paste while I'm cutting. First angled cut, and while we do want to be working quickly because the clay dries quickly, this is an important place to go carefully and make sure you get it right. I'm realigning this, and then go in for the second angled cut. More paste. And while pulling the ends gently toward each other, I press down. Blend. And trim. And now it goes to dry, and we will remember to rotate. Now we have two rings. One is of equal width all around, and the other has a thicker side and a thinner side, which I call a high-low for my own reference. For the high-low, the narrow part sits inside of the finger, where we will cover the seam with a secret embellishment. And for the even band, the seam can sit on the top of the finger and be covered by a feature, which will also strengthen the seam. For the high-low, I'm going to make a leaf, wide enough to cover the entire disrupted area, but thin enough that it's not adding too much bulk to the band. I like to think of this as a secret embellishment because it will only be visible on the inside of the band, kind of like a secret for the person who wears it. This could also be rectangular, ovoid, circular. It could have a pattern or be smooth. It can also repeat around the band. I could have done multiple leaves end to end. On the feature side of this ring, I am going to continue with leaves. I'm going to put a set of 3 in keeping with the theme. I like to build them on site. You can also make them separately beforehand, and once they're dry you can attach them if that is more comfortable. Now for the even ring. Let's first look inside. I'm going to use paste and then water to smooth out this internal seam. After this paste dries, I'll need to repeat this at least 2 more times because the paste will shrink as it dries, and you probably are familiar with that, but it often means putting more paste over the same area until you've achieved the look you want. Here it is dry, so I'm adding in the next layer until it's covered. Including on the edges. This is what the high-low looks like after drying. This is what the high-low looks like after drying. Another tip here is that you can use a burnisher on pre-fired clay to see what it will start to look like once it's fired. Even in this state, it will start to reflect light in the way that it will once it's polished. This actually helped me to decide I wanted to add one more element to the top, which you'll see later. Back on the even band, we're going to build a little block to contain a few cubic zirconia. And I don't know how many cubic zirconia I'm going to use at the moment because my goal here is to have this little block cover the entirety of the seam. So first I want to find out what size it needs to be to accomplish that, and then I will think about my stone design. Although I need to think very quickly because I intend to set the stones in here while this clay is not yet dry. I settled on using 3 tiny cubic zirconia in a pattern following Orion's belt. The constellation was my inspiration. After this dries, it is important that I remove any dried clay from the cubic zirconia or it will adhere in the firing process and I won't be able to get it off. Again with the burnisher to see what the texture will look like. Let's look at sizing. Now I can't push this firmly down onto the mandrel because it may break, so there may be a little more play in the size than this indicates, maybe 1/10 of a ring size, but I am confident calling this a pre-fire size 8. The even band is at 8.25. The width on this is about 1.6 millimeters. And this one is 1.6 millimeters. This is what the insides of the seams look like right now. This is what they look like on. And surprise, this is now a plum ring because those are plum-shaped leaves, and so it just seemed right. I'm taking a final look, again making sure those cubic zirconia are clear and clean, and now we will prep them for fire. I'm going to make ring sizer pellets. These keep the rings from shrinking beyond a particular size. As I mix these up, I'm going to talk about shrinkage, which can get a little nuanced, but we will go slowly through it. There's also a ring making size guide from Art Clay Silver that I'll link in the caption. It is an excellent resource, and also I consider it a jumping off point given what I'm about to share with you now. The first important thing to know on shrinkage is that different silver clays shrink at slightly different rates. However, even for a single clay, that clay will shrink one amount if it's torch fired for 5 minutes, a different amount if it's torch fired for 20 minutes, and a different amount if it's kiln fired for the maximum time and temperature recommended for that clay. The shrinkage rate will also depend on the width of the ring, the thickness of the ring wall, and whether or not there's a feature or an extra thickness somewhere on it. It will also shrink in every direction, meaning the size of the ring will change, but also the thickness of the wall will change. In short, it can be hard to calculate what the originating size should be until you've made several rings, and that is a hard but true thing about making them. So the pellets are one tool we can use to make sure, if you need this to fit a size 6 finger, that this won't wind up smaller than that. If we are using pellets, we want to make them at least 2 sizes larger than the goal size. I like to make these in advance. They take about 2 hours to set up. I'm checking with a fingernail there to see if it will leave a mark, and it's not really, so they're good to go. I'm using my favorite soldering setup, which is a super wool fiber blanket over a paving brick. For this ring with the cubic zirconia, we want those stones to be facing down into the super wool fiber blanket. Not all stones can be fired with a torch, but these can. I'm using a small butane torch. The small ones from the hardware store can actually go for long enough for this kind of work. And I do think you should fire one item at a time because you can only really keep one at the proper sustained glow. That was the binder burning off. Sometimes it's more dramatic and it looks like a little fire. Sometimes we just see the smoke. Either way, of course, your area needs to be free of anything that could catch fire, including curtains, paper, hair, etc. Use good judgment whenever you're using a torch. You can also see more clearly in some of these angles how there is a space between the pellet and the ring, and we're going to watch how that space gets smaller and smaller during the firing process. After the binder burns off, then you want to hold your piece at the orange glow I was just referring to, and you want to move your torch constantly. This is really the key. If you keep your torch in one place, there's a very high chance you will melt your silver. It can take a minute to build up to the orange glow. You can see it's starting to happen here. And it is much easier to see if your room is dark. So you want to minimize lights and sunlight so that you can see what's happening. I'm about to close my blinds so you can see the difference. While we fire this, I want to say one more thing about the strength of silver clay fired by torch. A piece of silver clay that's fired for 5 minutes is not going to be as strong as a piece that's fired for 10, and the same can be said for 20. So if you have the endurance in you and you have the safe setup, I encourage you to fire for as long as you can. Even 25 minutes would make a really strong piece. Now watch this glow coming up. It's going to be just a little more neon than what we've been doing. That's about a second away from melting. Once it melts, there's no coming back, so you don't want it to happen. Keep the torch moving. Just for fun, here's a look at the binder burning off of the peach ring also. Once the binder burned off of these, I fired each one with the torch for 10 minutes. And now you can see that the rings are pretty snug around the pellets, and it's time to take the pellets out. Following the instructions for the pellets, I'm going to soak these in water, but it's really important that you know that stones like the cubic zirconia cannot be quenched when they are hot. That means if they're still hot, if the ring is still hot, do not put it in water. The stones will crack. And I just want to show you what happens here because it looks kind of fun. Bloop! Now here's a final but important and I think interesting note on sizing. Because I torch fired these for 10 minutes, they shrank only part way to their potential shrink size. If I had fired them for 20 minutes with a torch, they would have shrunk even a little more and therefore been even a little stronger. I went back and fired these in the kiln to see what sizes they would end up at if unimpeded by pellets, and these were the results. From their torched size, they shrank a further 0.65 and 0.75 of a ring size in the kiln. From their original sizes, the Plum band shrank a total of 2 sizes, almost exactly, and the Orion's belt band shrank 2.5 sizes. So I hope this helps you understand how the dimension in every direction of a silver clay ring can affect ring size, how valuable the pellets are, and how to use all of these materials together to get the results that you want.